Hey everybody, this is Marble Knight. Just wanted to do a quick video on raising or lowering the rear suspension of a late Beetle. This Beetle is a 74. It's got a independent rear suspension as opposed to the swing axle that you'll find on the earlier ones. These are a little bit harder to raise or lower in my opinion, just because of the way the diagonal arm limits the movement of the axle when you get it free and you want to move it out of the way of the spring plate so that you can start manipulating the spring plate. It doesn't really get out of the way that easily, so I'm going to show you some tricks, maybe make it a little easier for you. First thing you want to do is clean up this area pretty good where the spring plate meets the diagonal arm. You got 3 bolts that hold those 2 pieces together. You want to mark the location of the diagonal arm in relation to the spring plate, talking about this way back and forth. Okay, so what I do is I clean it up, take a magic marker and kind of draw it around there, and I also take a file and go right across the top of the spring plate and make sure I hit the top of the diagonal arm ear as well, so that I've got a line that goes right across the top, and I can look across that and make sure that everything is lined up. What that controls is your toe. Okay, so you want to have a slight toe in back here. A toe out is kind of dangerous and promotes oversteering. So what you want to do is make sure you keep what you've got if you're happy with that. Otherwise, you're going to have your suspension lined up again. So once you've got that marked, then dive right in with a 19mm and loosen it up. And it goes without saying that up to this point I have raised the car and supported it securely on jack stands. And now we got those bolts off. Next thing you want to do is remove the bolt up here that holds your shock on. This is also a 19. Some people take the shock loose down at the bottom. I don't think it really matters. This one's kind of easier for me to get to. I don't like crawling around in the dirt that much, so go ahead and loosen that one, and you might need to drive it out after you've got it loose. We'll see how this one comes along. I've got the nut off, and I'm just going to drive the bolt out of the way. That shock turn around. Might need to extend it a little bit. Be a bugger to get it out there. Tell you what we'll do is just leave it sticking in there just like that. 6 will be fine. Get it out of the way. Alright. Next thing you want to do is get this rubber boot, the stroke limiter off, which you got to be careful. You can kind of break this thing, so work it around in all directions. And eventually, after you work it a little bit, it will pop off of the little mount that it fits on. Okay, and once you've got that off, you should be able to move the diagonal arm up and down. So you can see we've got some travel here to play with, and what's going to end up happening is it's not going to be enough to clear the spring plate completely, but we can do a little trick and get around that. So kind of make sure your shock is out of the way. What's going to happen is we're going to bring the diagonal arm up so far that the little mount that the rubber boot was on is actually going to come up here and contact the stop. We're going to bring it up that far, and then we're going to support it from underneath so that we can get access to the spring plate. Alright, you can see what I got at this point is the diagonal arm has been raised up to its uppermost position. You can tell that the little mount that the rubber stroke limiter used to sit on is just about up in contact with the upper stroke limiter, and I've got just a block to support the diagonal arm right there. And I went ahead and positioned a jack right underneath the spring arm. You can see that we have just a little bit of overlap right here, getting ready to raise the spring arm up until it comes up off of its stop, which is right there. You want to raise it up just enough to get it off of that stop, maybe just a little bit more, and then we're going to use a screwdriver, a large screwdriver, to start getting it off that stop once we take off the cover where the bushings and stuff are in there. Alright, now we got the spring arm jacked up a bit off of the stop. You can see a little bit of a gap here. So in order to get the spring plate off, we're going to have to take the cover off that houses the bushings in there and also holds the spring plate up against the chassis. So what we'll need to do is break these 15mm bolts loose and remove this plate. And it's going to be, if you want to take it all the way off, it's going to be kind of difficult to do that because of a clearance issue right here. You do not have to take it all the way off unless you really want to replace those rubber bushings that are in there, which I do recommend if you are building a Baja or whatever and you want to keep that suspension going as good as possible for as long as possible. I suggest you pull those out of there and replace them with the nice rubber, the urethane types. This particular bug I'm just playing around with, so I'm not going to go to that extent. I'm not going to replace the rubber bushings with the urethane ones, although I have some. I just don't really see the need on this particular bug, so just get this plate off, and we're going to slip the spring plate down. Notice that I've used a pretty sturdy jack up underneath that spring arm. That's what you want to do. And also the way I've positioned the jack. I positioned the jack so that the arc that's created by the jack when it lifts up is complementary to the arc that's created by the spring arm when it moves up and down. You don't want to position the jack 90 degrees to what I've done here, because the arc that the jack would create when you start jacking it up would actually pull the spring plate away or push it in, depending on where you put it. So it's, in my opinion, it's just better to have it so that the arcs are complementary instead of perpendicular to one another. Now we got the plate free. Of course, age and rust and all that good stuff is going to have this pretty tight. Just kind of pry around there a little bit, get this thing loosened up, and get it moving. Alright, so there's one of the big rubber bushings. If you're not replacing them, then just leave it be. Get some talcum powder, and I like putting real talc all around that bushing in order to lube it up. So the next thing we're going to do is kind of slip that spring plate off of there. And usually what we do here is you take a big screwdriver or even a crowbar and slip it up in there like so, and then you're going to slowly release the pressure off of the jack, slowly lower the jack down, and make sure that you bring this forward enough to get it off of the stop. Okay. Alright, so now we're ready to slip the spring plate off of the stop, and the little trick that I was talking about before to get this done even while you've got some overlap still by the diagonal arm over the top of the spring plate, what you got to do is kind of get something in there and flex the spring plate a little bit so it's going to come out and over the stop when you start to let down your jack. Okay, so I'm going to do this carefully. Might have to, give it a shot once or twice. Okay. I can tell that it's over the stop now. You see it's still coming down, and it's still coming down. There we go. Just let it the rest of the way down. There we go. So that's the bottom position right there. First thing you want to do before you do anything else is go ahead and mark what position it ended up in. So take a screwdriver or whatever and get you a line. Right there to let you know what your starting position is. And the reason for that is when you pull this out and you start playing around with twisting it around on the splines, you want to know where you start out at and where you end up at in the end. What I usually do is use the outer splines. You got outer splines, you got inner splines. And the inner splines, there's 40 of them, and the outer ones, there's 44. And what I usually do is take it off the outer spline, turn it 1, and put it back on. And what that's going to do is bring the spring plate to where it covers up about half of that hole right there. And that's what you want. What you really want is for it to be equal on both sides. But you don't want to have too much lift because it'll overstress your torsion bars that are in there and possibly break them, or your suspension will just be so stiff that you're going to feel every single crack in the road, and your shocks are going to be useless because there's going to be so much preload on your spring plate and on your suspension that it's never going to compress. And in fact, later on you'll see, once we preload this spring plate a little bit more, we have to actually chain the jack to the chassis of the car so that when we're jacking up the spring plate, it doesn't jack up the whole car. There's going to be that much preload on it that you can actually jack up the whole car without actually moving the spring plate. So I'm going to work on getting this thing off of here so that we can turn it. Sometimes it is not nice when it's been on there for a little while. To give it some persuasion with a little crowbar, I kind of like using that. And this one is going to be nice. It's actually going to come out pretty simple. Alright, now when it comes out a little bit, you need to start looking and seeing if you can see whether or not you're coming off the inner splines or coming off the outer splines. And depending on what you want to do, you might want to try and manipulate the situation. It is kind of tough to get it to come off the one that you want it to come off of. It feels like to me that it is coming off the, came off the inner, I think. Yeah, so here we go. Alright, see the orange thing is your torsion bar, and I can tell just from the way that it feels, the way it's kind of still stuck in the outer cup, that it came off of the inner splines, which I don't want. I mean, if you choose to do that, then that's fine. You can turn it one spline on the inner as well. You're just going to turn it a little bit more. I think that's closer to 9 degrees if you do it on one of the inner splines, and if you turn one of the outer splines, then it's closer to a little over 8 degrees. I think it's like 8 degrees in 10 minutes or something like that. So just a little bit more. So anyway, I'm going to work on trying to get this torsion bar free from the outer cup, get the outer splines free, and then put it back in there so I can just take the cup off on the outside and then turn the outer part and not the inner part. Okay, we got the spring arm set into the position that I want it in. It's one turn on the outer splines, so you can see the location of the new position as opposed to the old one, the shiny mark. Should be right at between 8 and 9 degrees. And the reference that I told you about before, looking through the bottommost hole down here, hopefully you can see that. Yeah, see that the hole is about halfway covered by the bottom of the spring arm. Alright, we've reached the point where we want to jack up the spring plate and get it back on its stop. There are a few things that you need to do in preparation for that. Number one is, once you get your jack into position, you need to loop a chain around the bottom of your jack and loop it around a strong structural member of the chassis. And I usually just pick the torsion tube because it's convenient and you can get the chain around it. So loop it around there, bolt it off or something. The reason you're doing that is because when you start to jack up on the spring plate, the upward force is going to be actually less than the downward force of the spring plate acting downwards, and you'll end up jacking up the whole car. So the chain will actually keep the car on the ground, the rest of the chassis on the ground, and it'll allow you to jack the spring plate up. Now, next thing you need to do is go ahead and get your bolts started in the cover plate. So you can see I've already got mine in there. They're not tight, they're just started. All you gotta do is get them started. You won't be able to get that one started if you're raising your suspension, because the spring plate will be in the way. So just go ahead and get them started in there, and next thing to do, go ahead and start jacking up the spring plate a little bit. You want to get it to the point where it's going to start touching the diagonal arm, which is exactly where I am right now. And you can see how it's already touching right there. At that point, what you got to do is sneak the spring plate around behind the diagonal arm ear. If it goes up in front, then I mean, that's obviously not a good thing. You'll have to reset the whole thing and do it over again because the spring plate is supposed to be behind it. So use the same method as we used before to get the spring plate off of its stop, you know, with a screwdriver or a crowbar. Kind of use that same method to get the spring plate back behind the diagonal arm and where it should be, so that way when you jack it all the way up, you'll be in the right position when you know, set everything back, and you can just run your bolts in and you'll be done. So that's kind of where we are now. So I'm going to work on this a little bit. Now I'm just making sure that the spring plate is unstressed. Probably a little bit of tension on it right now. Just keep going up until it's above the stop. There it is. See that? So now it is above the stop and we're ready to press it back on. A couple of different ways you can do that. It's kind of hard to smack the outer tube with a hammer because you've got the fender in the way. That is a real inconvenience when doing this job. So if you want to take the fender off, then you know, you can do that and make it a little bit easier for you. I tend not to because it is such a pain in the butt to get the seal in between the body of the car and the fender back into the right place. If you've ever done that job, you know it's a really tough one. So I kind of make do with leaving the fender on, and I use the bolts, the 4 bolts that hold the cover on there as a way to push it back on. And you can also smack it with a hammer where you can get to it, and that kind of helps a little bit. Just remember, it's got so much freaking tension on it right now, it's not hardly going to move at all by hitting it with a hammer or anything. So really those 4 bolts seem to be about the best way to get it back on there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop right here and put those bolts in, put the last bolt in, which can be a real pain. Sometimes you have to kind of take a Dremel tool and, you know, grind out a little bit of this hole right here so that the last bolt passes through if it doesn't go right in, and then tighten them all down. What that'll do is push your spring plate back into position, and you should be about good to go at that point. So we got our spring plate behind our diagonal arm. Didn't have to do anything to the diagonal arm whatsoever. You know, on other versions of this job, you may see that people have to take the emergency brake loose or do, you know, a couple other things to the whole setup in order to get this to work. But all I didn't even take the CV axle loose. You know, you see that's still plugged in nice right there. All I did was take it loose from the spring plate and move it out of the way. That's what makes this version the best, in my opinion. It's pretty simple. So I'm going to get these bolts in here, get that plate tightened down, and show you the last part of it. Alright peoples, we got it pretty much back into position. The spring plate cover is on. All 4 bolts are tightened down. You can see that the spring plate's been pushed back far enough to where it is over the top of the stop, so when we let it down, it'll rest there. It'll take a couple of times, you know, moving up and down through regular road travel before it really presses all the way back in. But the important thing is that you get the spring plate on, the cover on, and those rubber bushings in there are going to want to press it back in once that cover is tightened down. So you'll be good to go after that. So now all there is left to do really is to release the final little amount of tension that there is on the spring plate, which I'm doing right now. Make sure your jack stands are positioned properly before you do this, because it's likely that you've jacked up the car a little bit during this process. Okay, there we go. Heed my own advice here and look at my jack stands. Yep, and it's actually needs a little repositioning. once you got that done, it's pretty well safe again. The spring plate's not going to slip off of there or anything, so reach down in there and undo your chain, whatever fasteners you got that you use to fasten your chain together. Take them off and slide your jack away. Then you can let your diagonal arm fall back into place, bolt it up, make sure it goes back with your mark that you made on the spring plate. Remember, that controls your toe in and toe out, so you want to be sure you get that back in the right place. Put your bolts in place. Put your fastener back in your upper shock tower, and put the rubber stroke limiter back on there, and put tar back on and drive the car. Should be good to go after that. And this whole video has been about raising the suspension. You can do it the other way as well. You can lower it by moving it a spline up instead of a spline down, depending on what you want to do. Kind of a Baja man myself, so I raise them, I don't lower them. Got any questions, let me know. See ya.